May 1st, 1945. 3:50 in the afternoon. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin stood at his desk reading a cable from Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Behind him, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Secret Police Chief Lavrenti Beria waited, watching his face for a reaction that didn't come. The message was clear. Adolf Hitler was dead. The war in Europe nearly over. Stalin read it twice. Then he looked up, and what he said in that moment would reveal everything about trust, paranoia, and why victory felt like the beginning of something darker. The cable had arrived from Berlin 20 minutes earlier. Zhukov's forces had taken the Reichstag 3 days before. Soviet soldiers had raised the hammer and sickle flag over its ruined dome while fighting still raged in the streets below. Now, in the basement of what remained of the Reich Chancellery, Red Army troops had found bodies. 2 bodies, badly burned. A man and a woman. Hitler and Eva Braun, according to witnesses still alive in the bunker. Dental records would need confirmation. But the Germans insisted Hitler had taken his own life on April 30th, the day before. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. Stalin set the cable down. He walked to the window. Outside, Moscow stretched away toward the horizon, intact, untouched by German boots, saved by distance and Russian blood. 27 million Soviet citizens dead. 800,000 soldiers lost at Stalingrad alone. Leningrad besieged for 900 days, 1 million dead from starvation. The Soviet Union had paid for victory with a currency no one else could comprehend. And now Hitler was dead. Just like that, a bullet in a bunker. "Do we believe this?" Stalin asked, not turning around. Beria stepped forward. The head of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, carried a folder thick with intelligence reports. His voice stayed careful, measured. "The evidence appears consistent, Comrade Stalin. Multiple witnesses. The bodies discovered by our troops." The SS officer who handled the burial gave a detailed statement. "Appears consistent," Stalin repeated. He turned now, his eyes on Beria. "The greatest criminal in human history, the man who invaded our country with 3 million soldiers, who tried to enslave our people, who burned our villages and murdered our children, this man shoots himself in a basement, and we're supposed to accept it because witnesses say so?" The room went quiet. Molotov shifted his weight. Outside the window, a truck rattled past on the street below. Stalin had spent 4 years learning not to trust anything. In 1941, he'd ignored dozens of warnings about the German invasion, convinced it was British disinformation meant to drag the Soviet Union into war prematurely. Operation Barbarossa had come anyway, at dawn on June 22nd, across a 1,000-mile front. Stalin had disappeared for 11 days, paralyzed by the catastrophic miscalculation. He'd learned. Trust nothing. Verify everything. Assume deception until proven otherwise. "Find the body," Stalin said. "The actual body. Not burned, remains identified by some SS officer trying to save his own skin. I want forensic evidence. Dental records verified by our own doctors. Until then, we proceed as if Hitler is alive." Zhukov, listening from Berlin, would later describe the order as both paranoid and strategically sound. If Hitler had somehow escaped, if this was an elaborate deception, then declaring him dead would be the greatest intelligence failure in Soviet history. But there was something else in Stalin's refusal to believe, something beyond strategic caution. "If Hitler is alive," Stalin continued, speaking slowly now, each word deliberate, "then he's running, and if he's running, someone helped him. The British, maybe. The Americans. They're already negotiating separate peace deals with German generals in Italy, trying to end the war in the West while leaving us to bleed. Why wouldn't they help Hitler escape if it meant preventing us from capturing him?" This was the world Stalin inhabited now. 4 years of total war had killed the man who'd once believed in socialist revolution, who trusted the non-aggression pact with Hitler right up until the moment panzers crossed the border. that Stalin was gone. The man who remained saw enemies everywhere, conspiracies in every shadow, betrayal waiting in every alliance. "The Americans and British," he said, walking back to his desk. "They'll want to be first to confirm Hitler's death. They'll want to investigate the bunker themselves. They'll want access to witnesses, and if we let them control this narrative, then we lose control of how this war ends." He picked up the cable again, reading it a third time as if different words might appear. "Seal the bunker," Stalin ordered. "No Western access, our troops only. Find every witness still alive. Question them separately. Record everything, and find the body." Beria made notes. Molotov nodded. Neither man suggested that maybe, possibly, Hitler really was dead. You didn't survive in Stalin's inner circle by questioning his instincts, even when those instincts spiraled toward paranoia. Because here was the truth Stalin understood, but couldn't speak aloud. Hitler's death meant nothing. The war was ending, yes. Germany would surrender within days. But the real war, the one Stalin had been preparing for since 1943, since Stalingrad, since the moment he realized the Soviet Union would survive and the Western Allies would eventually land in France. That war was just beginning. The war for Europe's future. The war over who would control what remained of Germany. The war over which system, capitalism or communism, would dominate the post-war world. Hitler alive meant one more enemy to defeat. Hitler dead meant the enemy became the men who'd been Stalin's allies for 4 years. "Get me Roosevelt," Stalin said suddenly. Then he paused, remembering. "No, get me Truman." Roosevelt had died 3 weeks earlier. Harry Truman, the new American president, was an unknown quantity. Stalin had met Roosevelt at Tehran and Yalta, had measured the man, had found ways to work with him despite mutual suspicion. Truman was different, untested, potentially more hostile. The operator connected the call. Across 7 time zones, through undersea cables and military switchboards, Stalin's voice reached Washington. It was evening there. April 30th still, the calendar catching up slowly. "Mr. President," Stalin said in Russian, waiting for the translator, "I've received reports that Hitler may be dead. Have you received similar intelligence?" Truman's response came back through the translation delay. "We've heard rumors, Marshal Stalin. Nothing confirmed yet. Our forces haven't reached Berlin." "Nor should they," Stalin said, his voice hardening slightly. "Berlin is in the Soviet sector, as agreed. We'll handle the investigation. I wanted to inform you directly. We're treating this as unconfirmed until we have physical evidence." A pause on the line. Then Truman, "We appreciate the notification. I trust you'll share your findings with all Allied parties." "Of course," Stalin said. He didn't mean it. Truman probably knew he didn't mean it. The war was ending, but honesty wasn't part of the peace. Stalin hung up. He looked at Beria and Molotov, both still waiting. "They'll send intelligence officers to Berlin," Stalin said. "British and American. They'll try to investigate independently. They'll want to be first to announce Hitler's death to the world, to claim credit for victory. Stop them. The bunker is Soviet territory. We control access. We control the narrative." What Stalin didn't say, what he was only beginning to understand, was that Hitler's death, real or faked, confirmed or contested, had already changed the war's meaning. For 4 years, the Grand Alliance had held together because Hitler existed, because Nazi Germany was an enemy so absolute that capitalism and communism could coexist in common cause. Without Hitler, what held them together? By May 2nd, Soviet troops had secured the Reich Chancellery bunker. The investigation began in rooms that smelled of diesel fuel, concrete dust, and something worse, death trapped underground for days. The bodies had been found in the Chancellery garden, buried in a shell crater, partially burned, doused with gasoline but not completely destroyed. Soviet intelligence officers photographed everything. A jawbone, dental work still visible, clothing fragments, a skull with a bullet hole. But were they Hitler's remains? The SS officer who'd supervised the burial, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Günsche, gave detailed testimony. Hitler had died by his own hand at approximately 3:30 p.m. on April 30th. Eva Braun had taken cyanide. Günsche and others had carried the bodies up to the garden, placed them in a crater, doused them with gasoline, and set them ablaze while Soviet artillery hammered the city. The testimony was precise, almost too precise, as if rehearsed. Stalin, reading the reports in Moscow, found every detail suspicious. Why burn the bodies if Hitler wanted proof of his death? Why not leave them intact? Unless, and this was the thought that kept circling through Stalin's mind, unless the bodies in the crater weren't Hitler at all, unless the whole scene was staged. "Send our best forensic experts," Stalin ordered. "I want dental specialists, pathologists, intelligence officers who can detect forgery. And I want interrogations, real interrogations, not polite questioning." In Berlin, a special NKVD team took over the investigation. They brought in Hitler's personal dentist's assistant, Korte Häuser-Mann, who'd been found hiding in the city. She identified the dental work in the recovered jaw, Hitler's bridges and crowns, distinctive patterns she'd seen dozens of times. But Stalin wasn't satisfied. She could be lying. The Germans could have planted her, prepared her testimony. They knew we'd look for dental records. They could have created fake dental work that matches Hitler's records. This was paranoia, yes. But it was also professional skepticism taken to its logical extreme. Stalin had spent years eliminating enemies through show trials, false confessions, fabricated evidence. He knew how easy it was to create convincing lies. Why wouldn't Hitler's loyalists do the same? By May 4th, Germany's unconditional surrender was days away. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's chosen successor, was negotiating terms. The European war was effectively over, but in Moscow, Stalin's obsession with Hitler's death deepened. "I want every witness questioned separately," he ordered. "Compare their stories. Find inconsistencies. Someone knows the truth." The interrogations continued through May. SS officers, bunker staff, Hitler's secretaries, his bodyguards, all gave similar accounts. Hitler and Eva Braun had retreated to their private rooms on April 30th. A single gunshot heard around 3:30 p.m. Bodies carried upstairs, burned in the garden. The consistency itself seemed suspicious to Stalin. Then, on May 5th, British and American intelligence officers arrived in Berlin, demanding access to the bunker. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, wanted independent confirmation of Hitler's death. Winston Churchill wanted British investigators on the scene. Stalin refused. "The bunker is in Soviet-controlled territory. We'll share our findings when the investigation is complete." This wasn't about evidence anymore. This was about power, about who controlled the story, about ensuring that when the world learned of Hitler's death, it would be Stalin who announced it, Stalin who provided the proof, Stalin who claimed final victory. But there was another layer to Stalin's refusal, one he revealed only in private conversations with Beria. "If Hitler escaped," Stalin said, walking the Kremlin's corridors late one night, "if the British or Americans helped him, or worse, if they captured him and are keeping it secret, then we need leverage. We need to be able to say we never confirmed his death. We need deniability." "You believe they'd help Hitler?" Beria asked carefully. Stalin stopped walking. Outside the windows, Moscow slept under late spring darkness. "I believe they'd do whatever served their interests. Churchill hates communism more than he hated Hitler. He said so himself before the war. He said if Germany invaded hell, he'd make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." This was the calculation that haunted Stalin. What if the Western Allies had decided in the war's final weeks that a defeated Germany under Hitler was preferable to a Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe? What if they'd offered Hitler asylum in exchange for testimony about Soviet war plans, Soviet intentions, Soviet secrets? It seemed far-fetched. But Stalin had seen stranger betrayals. By May 9th, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Celebrations erupted across the Soviet Union. In Moscow, in Leningrad, in Stalingrad's ruins, in every city and village that had survived 4 years of existential struggle. But when journalists asked Stalin about Hitler's fate, his answer was cold and certain. We have not found Hitler's body. Until we do, we must consider the possibility that he escaped. The Western Allies reacted with frustration and confusion. General Eisenhower, in his own investigation, had concluded Hitler was almost certainly dead. British intelligence agreed. The evidence was overwhelming. Why was Stalin claiming otherwise? The answer lay not in evidence, but in psychology. Stalin, sitting in the Kremlin reading report after report, had made a decision that went beyond forensics. He would not, could not, let the war end with Hitler's simple death. Because if Hitler had died so easily, so quietly, by his own hand in a bunker while his empire burned around him, then what had all the Soviet suffering meant? 27 million dead, cities destroyed, families scattered, children orphaned, and Hitler simply put a gun in his mouth and ended it? No. Stalin needed more than that. He needed Hitler alive, running, hunted. He needed the narrative of pursuit, of justice delayed but inevitable. He needed to tell the Soviet people that their enemy hadn't chosen death on his own terms. He'd been driven to it, cornered, desperate, or better yet, hadn't chosen death at all. Was still out there, still threatened them, still justified the massive security apparatus Stalin was building to control post-war Eastern Europe. Keep investigating, Stalin ordered in June, even as the physical evidence mounted. Soviet pathologists had examined the remains. The dental work matched Hitler's records precisely. Witnesses' testimonies aligned. Chemical analysis of the bones showed death around April 30th. Everything pointed to a tragic end in the bunker, exactly as reported. But Stalin issued a statement to Soviet news agencies. The fate of Adolf Hitler remains unknown. Reports of his death are unconfirmed. The investigation continues. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers stationed around the sealed bunker wondered what they were guarding. The answer, a crime scene that might not be a crime scene. Evidence that might not be evidence. A body that might not be a body. Or, and this was closer to the truth, a symbol. A symbol of Stalin's refusal to accept simple narratives, his determination to control how history was written, his understanding that power in the post-war world would belong to whoever shaped the story. The twist came not from new evidence, but from Stalin's own words, spoken in private to his inner circle in July 1945. The setting was a late-night meeting in Stalin's Kremlin office. Beria had just presented yet another forensic report confirming the remains were Hitler's. Dental records matched. Facial reconstruction matched. Toxicology showed cyanide and gunshot trauma. Every scientific test pointed to the same conclusion. Stalin listened without interrupting. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something that revealed the truth he'd known all along. "Of course it's Hitler," Stalin said quietly. "Of course he took his own life. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I can't read forensic reports?" The room went silent. Beria exchanged glances with Molotov. If Stalin knew the remains were genuine, why had he spent months claiming otherwise? "Let me tell you something about the truth," Stalin continued, his voice taking on the pedagogical tone he used when teaching lessons he considered vital. "The truth doesn't matter if no one believes it. Or worse, if everyone believes it and it makes you weaker." He stood up, walking to the window as he so often did when thinking deeply. Hitler took his own life because he was a coward. He killed 50 million people, destroyed half of Europe, invaded my country and murdered 27 million Soviet citizens, and when he lost, when we were coming for him, he took the coward's way out, put a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Stalin turned back to face the room. Is that how this war ends? Is that the story? The great villain escapes justice by escaping life itself? We spent 4 years fighting for survival, and the man responsible for it all just ends it. On his terms? Now the logic became clear. This wasn't about evidence. This wasn't about paranoia, at least not entirely. This was about narrative control, about refusing to let Hitler have even the dignity of choosing his own death. If we confirm Hitler's death, Stalin said, we validate his escape. We let him avoid the trial, the execution, the public accounting. We let him die a soldier's death in a bunker instead of dangling from a rope in Nuremberg. He walked back to his desk, picking up the latest forensic report. But if we keep questioning, if we keep saying we can't confirm his death, if we suggest he might have escaped, might be hiding somewhere, might be protected by the British or Americans, then we accomplish several things. Stalin began counting on his fingers, the way he did when making strategic calculations. First, we prevent Hitler from becoming a martyr. Dead in battle, some Germans might see nobility. Dead by his own hand, definitive and confirmed, gives closure. But uncertain, possibly escaped. That makes him a coward who ran. That makes his followers question everything. Second, we create doubt about Western intentions. If Hitler escaped, who helped him? The British? The Americans? We plant those seeds now, and in the future, when we need to explain why we can't trust our former allies, we have this foundation. Third, we maintain psychological warfare. Let the West think we don't believe their intelligence. Let them think we suspect them of collaboration. Keep them off balance. Make them prove their loyalty by giving us concessions in the peace negotiations. Fourth, and this matters most, we tell the Soviet people that the war isn't really over, that vigilance is still required, that enemies still threaten us, that the NKVD must keep working, the military must stay strong, the state must maintain control. Beria was writing notes. This was the kind of strategic thinking he understood, using truth selectively, bending reality to serve state interests. But Molotov, who'd negotiated with the West for years, who'd sat across from Roosevelt and Churchill and tried to find common ground, asked the dangerous question, what happens when they prove he's dead, when the evidence becomes undeniable even to our own people? Stalin smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Then we were simply being careful, thorough, refusing to accept Western propaganda without Soviet verification. We'll release our own reports years from now, when it no longer matters. By then, the doubt will be planted. The suspicion will be permanent. And we'll have used Hitler's death, or the uncertainty about it, to serve our purposes. This was the moment Stalin's closest advisors understood. Their leader hadn't gone mad with paranoia. He'd done something more calculated and more chilling. He'd turned Hitler's tragic end into a weapon, a tool of propaganda and psychological warfare that would serve Soviet interests long after the war ended. So yes, Stalin said, sitting back down, the body in the bunker is Hitler. Our scientists are certain. Our evidence is conclusive. But officially, to the world, to the Soviet people, to the Western allies, we have doubts. We're still investigating. We can't confirm anything. How long do we maintain this position? Beria asked. Years, Stalin said, until it no longer serves us, or forever, if that's what serves us best. The irony was brutal. Hitler had tried to destroy the Soviet Union through military conquest. Stalin would destroy Hitler's legacy through narrative control. Hitler would be denied even the simple fact of his own death, not because Stalin didn't know the truth, but because Stalin understood that controlling the story mattered more than confirming the facts. In the weeks that followed, Soviet authorities continued to investigate the bunker, to question witnesses, to analyze evidence, all while knowing the conclusion already. It was theater, performed for multiple audiences: the Soviet people, the Western allies, future historians. Stalin gave interviews to Western journalists throughout the summer of 1945, each time expressing doubt about Hitler's death. "We found no body," he told a British reporter in June, which was technically true. They'd found burned remains, not an intact body. "I believe Hitler is alive, perhaps in Spain or Argentina," he told an American correspondent in July, despite his own intelligence services reporting no evidence of escape. "The Germans are expert at deception," he told a Soviet newspaper in August, as if his own security services hadn't been interrogating witnesses for months. Each statement served the purpose: keep doubt alive, maintain uncertainty, control the narrative. The Western Allies, frustrated by Stalin's refusal to confirm what seemed obvious, began their own investigations. British intelligence officer Hugh Trevor Roper spent months reconstructing Hitler's final days, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence. His conclusion: Hitler's life had ended on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker. The evidence was overwhelming. Stalin dismissed the report as Western propaganda. The truth about Stalin's response to Hitler's death emerged slowly, over decades, through declassified documents and memoirs published after Stalin's own death in 1953. What actually happened in that moment on May 1st, 1945, when Stalin first read the cable from Zhukov? According to Molotov, speaking years later, Stalin's initial reaction wasn't skepticism or strategic calculation. It was something simpler and more human: disappointment. "He wanted Hitler alive," Molotov said in a 1970s interview. "He wanted Hitler in chains, on trial, confessing, executed. He wanted justice that the world could see. Hitler's tragic end robbed him of that. Everything else, the doubt, the investigation, the claims of escape, that came later." But in that first moment, reading that cable, Stalin's expression was frustration, like a man who'd been promised something and then had it taken away. The forensic evidence, locked in Soviet archives for decades, told the definitive story. In 1946, Soviet pathologists completed their analysis of the remains found in the Chancellery Garden. They confirmed Adolf Hitler, male, approximately 55-56 years old, died from gunshot wound to the head combined with cyanide poisoning, approximately April 30th, 1945, between 3 Mars and 4 p.m. The report went into a safe in NKVD headquarters. It wouldn't be published until 1968, 23 years later, long after Stalin's death, when Soviet interests had shifted and maintaining doubt about Hitler's fate no longer served any purpose. In 1945, though, Stalin's public position remained unchanged. Hitler's fate was uncertain. This created a bizarre historical situation. In the West, historians accepted Hitler's death as established fact by late 1945. Books were published, documentaries made, Nuremberg trials proceeded with the understanding that Hitler had escaped justice through that tragic end. But in the Soviet Union, official statements continued to suggest Hitler might be alive, might have escaped, might be hiding somewhere under Western protection. The divergence shaped Cold War narratives in unexpected ways. Soviet citizens, told for years that Hitler's death was unconfirmed, came to believe in elaborate conspiracy theories. Hitler in Argentina, Hitler protected by the CIA, Hitler still pulling strings from a secret location. These theories persisted long after they served any propaganda purpose, taking on lives of their own. Stalin himself never publicly confirmed Hitler's death. His last statement on the subject, given in 1950, maintained the position he'd established in May 1945. "We have not definitively established Hitler's fate. The investigation remains open." By then, it didn't matter. The Cold War had made Hitler's death a footnote. The real war, the one Stalin had anticipated, was in full swing. Eastern Europe under Soviet control. Western Europe rebuilding with American money. Germany divided. The nuclear arms race beginning. Hitler's death or survival was irrelevant to the new struggle. But Stalin's response to that cable on May 1st, 1945, revealed something essential about how power works in the modern world. Truth is a tool, not an absolute. Facts serve narratives. Even death, the most certain human fact, can be questioned, contested, denied, if doing so serves strategic interests. The individual fates of those involved played out as history often does, with brutal irony. Stalin, who'd questioned Hitler's death so thoroughly, would himself die in 1953 under mysterious circumstances. He suffered a stroke and lay unconscious for days while his advisors, paralyzed by fear and political calculation, delayed medical treatment. Some historians suggest they let him die deliberately, afraid to save him. The man who'd controlled narratives about death would have his own death's narrative controlled by others. Beria, who'd led the investigation into Hitler's remains, would be arrested 3 months after Stalin's death and executed. Molotov would outlive them all, surviving into the 1980s. In interviews late in life, he spoke about May 1945 with something like nostalgia. "We thought the hard part was over," he said. "We'd beaten Hitler. We'd saved our country. We'd won the greatest war in history. How naive we were. The hard part was just beginning." The burned remains found in the Chancellery Garden, examined, photographed, tested, documented, were moved multiple times in the decades after 1945, buried, exhumed, reburied. Finally, in 1970, the KGB dug them up one last time, crushed them, and threw the ashes into a river in Germany. Even in death, Hitler couldn't rest, couldn't find a grave, couldn't become a pilgrimage site for his followers. Stalin had wanted to control Hitler's death. In the end, he controlled everything about it except the fact of it. Looking back from the distance of 8 decades, what's striking isn't Stalin's paranoia or his propaganda. It's how thoroughly he understood the power of narrative over truth. He knew Hitler was dead within days of his death. He had forensic evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis. But he also knew something more important, that controlling what people believed mattered more than establishing what actually happened. It was a lesson the modern world would learn again and again, from Vietnam to Watergate to the digital age, where truth and narrative constantly war with each other, where facts are tools deployed by competing interests, where death itself can be a beginning rather than an end. The last word should belong to one of those Soviet soldiers who stood guard outside the bunker in May 1945, watching investigators come and go, knowing what they'd found, but ordered not to speak about it. His name was Viktor Alexeyev. He was 22 years old. He'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, survived wounds that killed most men, seen things no one should see. Asked in 1995, 50 years later, what he remembered about guarding the bunker where Hitler died, he sat quietly for a long moment before answering. "We knew the war was over," he said. "We knew we'd won. We knew Hitler was dead in there. Everyone knew whatever the orders said about keeping it secret, but we also knew that knowing something didn't make it real. Not officially. Not in a way that mattered. Stalin didn't believe it, or he believed it but wouldn't say so. And if Stalin didn't say it was true, then it wasn't true. That's what we'd learned. That's what we understood. Truth was whatever the leader said it was. Facts didn't matter if they didn't serve the state." He looked down at his hands, old and weathered, hands that had held rifles and dug trenches and lifted wounded comrades. "I stood there, outside that bunker, knowing Hitler was dead, knowing we'd won, knowing the worst was over. And I felt nothing, no joy, no relief. Because I'd learned over 4 years of war that endings are just beginnings in disguise. Hitler was dead. Stalin would make sure we never forgot to doubt it. And that doubt, that refusal to let the past be simple, to let the enemy just die, that would shape everything that came next." He smiled then, sad and knowing. People ask what Stalin said when he learned of Hitler's death. The answer is, he said many things, but the truest thing he said was nothing at all. He just asked questions, questions that were really statements, questions that meant, I will decide what this death means, not the death itself. And that, in the end, was the most terrifying thing about Stalin. Not that he didn't believe Hitler was dead, but that he knew Hitler was dead and chose to lie about it anyway. Because power isn't about knowing the truth. It's about deciding which truths matter. The burned earth of the Chancellery Garden, where those remains were found, is gone now, covered by streets and buildings, absorbed back into Berlin's rebuilt fabric. No marker exists, no sign, nothing to indicate that this was where Hitler's body burned, where Soviet soldiers found the evidence, where history ended and propaganda began, which is exactly what Stalin would have wanted. Not a monument to Hitler's death, but an absence. A space where certainty should exist but doesn't. A permanent question mark carved into history's record. May 1st, 1945. 3:50 in the afternoon. Joseph Stalin read a cable that said Adolf Hitler was dead. And in that moment, reading those words, Stalin made a choice that would echo for decades. The choice to question what he knew to be true, to weaponize doubt, to prove that in the modern world, controlling the story matters more than confirming the facts. Hitler took his own life in a bunker. Stalin made sure the world would never be quite certain. And between those two truths lies everything we need to understand about power, propaganda, and the distance between what happened and what we're told happened. The war ended. The questions never did.